I'm taking a look back at Alireza Firouzja's decisive games from Tata Steel 2021, and this game was a fascinating struggle against Alexander Donchenko, a rock-solid Russian GM playing with the white pieces here. Firouzja had the black pieces, and let's see what happened. And if you love a daily chess video, then do hit subscribe to never miss a daily video. So we started off with a Queen's Gambit declined, which Firouzja was playing in this tournament. But instead of going for the usual knight f6 here, he went for this really quirky move order of bishop to b4. So a kind of Nimzo-Indian hybrid, but the pawn's already come to d5, there's no knight on f6. Now knight f3 was played, and if knight f6 now, we're going back into the mainline Ragozin variation. But that wasn't played, we had d takes on c4, and after pawn to e3, pawn to b5, this is the really interesting idea, and we're actually transposing back across to a line of the semi-Slav known as the Noteboom variation, named after a Dutch player called Daniel Noteboom, who was playing in the late 20s, early 30s. So okay, let's see how this progresses. We had pawn to a4, undermining the chain. Now we had pawn to c6. You don't go with the a pawn or takes here and you're losing the rook. And now bishop to d2 breaks the pin, so you're renewing this threat of taking twice with the knight. And now you don't take with the bishop here, that's a bad position for black. Instead, pawn to a5 is the whole idea. And after captures, now you take the knight. The bishop recaptures, you take here, but white has the standard undermining move, pawn to b3. Now you don't go pawn to b4 immediately. This is a blunder after bishop takes on b4. Again, there's a pin against the undefended rook. So instead we have bishop to b7, holds the rook, threatens b4, so takes on c4, and now b4 comes. The bishop drops back to b2, and we had knight to f6. So it's a fascinating variation, this. Black has the two passed pawns connected, as we can see, but they are well blockaded for now between queen and rook. Often the bishop comes back and sits like this, but in compensation for giving black this, white has the big centre and can sometimes get a kingside attack going. So we had bishop to d3 now, castles from both players, knight b to d7, and now white has a choice. There are many ways to play in this position. Donchenko goes with knight to d2. The whole idea of this move is you're trying to set up a big pawn centre as white. Blow black off the board if possible here. So f4 is a threat, clamping on e5, and that's why e5 is played immediately. Best move in the position, I would say. And now Donchenko doesn't capture here because it looks a bit horrible ruining your pawn structure, but there's also a very concrete response of knight takes on e5. There's a tactic against the undefended bishop, so that if you take here, the queen picks up here. So instead of taking on e5, instead Donchenko plays bishop to c2, getting out of the line of these tactics. And both players now adopt a policy of just improving the position. So queen c7 connects Firouzja's rooks. We had pawn to h3, rook f to e8, bishop to b3. More subtle improvement of that piece, now looking down here. Pawn to h6. And now Donchenko has to find some kind of active plan here. He could go for f4 immediately. It's not necessarily the best move, but it's double-edged. But instead he goes for knight to f3 here, and he's setting up similar ideas of getting the f-pawn going, but first he wants to resolve this tension here. Now you don't want to push e4 as black. That would be positionally bad, because after the knight drops back to d2, you've now blunted your own bishop, and d5 is coming soon. It will open up this bishop, there's no pawn standing in the way, and white's just going to have a really nice initiative, plus this pawn could become weak later. So e4 wasn't played, rook a6 was played from Firouzja, a nice dual purpose move. Sometimes you're preparing to double on the a file and push this pawn. You also protect the 6th rank here, thinking about future attacks. So we had knight takes on e5 now, the knight recaptured, pawn takes, and best here was knight e4. Still looking to come into this key c5 square, but not allowing white to play bishop a4, pinning the knight to the rook. Because in the game, we saw knight to d7 here, and bishop a4 was a strong response, not letting the knight come to c5 immediately. If you go bishop c6 to break that pin, then bishop b5 comes. This is an uncomfortable move. You don't want to take like this, or the rook has to come back. You can't come to b6 or you lose the a5 pawn. All just a bit uncomfortable for black. It is playable, but okay, anyway, we didn't have bishop to a4. After knight d7, we had pawn to f4, holding this pawn here. Now we had knight to c5, and this is one of the key differences between the variations. After bishop c2, we had a4 from Firouzja. He gets these queenside pawns steamrolling down the board. So what's Donchenko's plan? Well, pawn to f5. He's going for the throat of the king. He has to get some counterplay. So b3 from Firouzja, that bishop dropped back, and now Firouzja missteps with rook a to a8. He should recognise the danger of these pawns rushing at his king and either give up an exchange here like this, or play pawn to a3, so that after rook captures, rook takes, bishop takes, he can recapture this one, probably with the queen, and at least he's stifled this white attack here and still has a passed pawn. But okay, we didn't have this. Instead, he drops this rook back, and now pawn to e6 comes, really dangerous. Now you can't capture this pawn, or f6 is just ripping open the position. If you take, then rook f6 comes, and there's way too many threats against the black king. The game is over, especially with the queen coming in. So if Firouzja didn't play like this, best here would have actually been pawn to f6, trying to shut everything down, but instead he goes for the active plan, as we so often see, queen to g3, threatening mate in 1. Now queen e2 was the best defence here, leaving this rook free for activities against the black king. But Donchenko goes rook to f2 defending, and now Firouzja could actually take here, because f6 doesn't carry the same venom. Now we can take, and the bishop has to recapture. Rook f8 could come, the position's completely different, black is doing well. But okay, we didn't have this variation. Instead, Firouzja plays the more human looking pawn to f6, trying to shut everything down. We had bishop to d4 hitting that knight. It jumped into e4, and now technically you can jump the rook up to f3 here, ask a question of the queen, but I can see why Donchenko didn't do this, walking into that bishop line. There could be discovered knight moves, so he just chops off that monster knight, but he does give Firouzja this very powerful light squared bishop, unopposed on e4, stifling this pawn here. So we had rook to a3 now, potentially preparing queen to a1, attacking this pawn. We had rook e to c8, hits the c pawn. The pawn progressed down the board. King to h7, tidy king safety move. And both players are into that 30 move mark now. Time is ticking down. And queen to d2 now instead of queen to a1. So potentially looking to come into b4 and pressure here. And now Firouzja goes for the active move. He loves to generate counterplay wherever he possibly can. Pawn to b2. Now white had to take with the bishop here and give up this pawn on c5, and the game is still very tense and wild. White has a weakness here, but black has a weakness here. Who knows what's going on? But instead of playing like this, Donchenko took with the queen, a fatal mistake, because you're giving Firouzja access to the b-file with tempo, supported by this deadly bishop. So the queen moved away now, and the rook came down to b1 with check. There's no king h2, as we note. Now the best here is actually just giving up the queen already, but rook f1 was played, the more human move. The other rook doubled. The queen came to f2, desperate to exchange here, but simply rook takes on f1 came now. The king recaptured. Rook b1 check, king e2. And now how do you continue the attack? There's no rook to b2 check because the bishop covers the square. There's a threat to swap off the queens here, and you want to check the black king, but you can't do it from here. But imagine if you could do it from here or here. So that's what the next move does. Queen b8, switching to the other side of the board now. Queen f4 desperately tries to get the queens off. There's basically nothing for white now. Queen b5 check comes, and king d2 was played. If you come to f2, then queen f1 is devastating. King g3, queen takes on g2, and so on. So coming back here, we had king to d2, but now there's this sequence of moves. Queen b4 check, the bishop blocks, queen takes on a3, the rook is simply dropping off. You do pick up this monster bishop on e4, but now we had queen c1 check. King d3 and queen f1 was the final move of the game. If you stagger up the board to d4, then rook d1 check comes, you're forced to give up your bishop, soon your queen will probably drop off or you get mated, the whole game is gone. If you enjoyed this game, then do click here to subscribe to the channel, and to see more amazing Firouzja games from Tata Steel, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.